If you're a victim of sexual abuse, please contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline. If you're afraid to talk to someone, you can always text the Sexual Abuse Crisis text line. Just remember, while you choose to stay silent, the sexual predator is getting off on watching you suffer in silence. Elisa Diaz is a small-town girl from the Poconos. Elisa moved to Philadelphia to pursue her lifelong dream, which is a career in law enforcement. At the age 5, Elisa told her parents when she grows up, she will become a cop. Elisa's parents decided to take Elisa to visit a police cadet school. Elisa was insistent with achieving her lifelong goal. In the year 2001, Elisa graduated from Delaware Valley High School. In the year 2003, Carl Holmes was the inspector at the Philadelphia Police Academy, which is where he first met Elisa Diaz. Carl told Elisa's parents that the department will take care of their daughter. During training, Carl warned Elisa once assigned to a district, she might experience weird things. He also told her that his door will always be open. Carl Holmes is a married man with 2 daughters. Carl is the son of a captain in the Philadelphia Fire Department. Carl grew up in Mount Airy. Carl graduated from LaSalle College High School. In the year 1983, Carl attended Temple University on a scholarship and starred as an offensive tackle on the school's football team. Carl went on to play for the Washington Redskins. In the year 1988, he was cut from the team's practice squad. 2 years later, Carl joined the police force. At the time, Elisa Diaz was 21 years old. She was 5'4" and weighed 125 pounds. She was the youngest in her class and excited to take on her new adventure. She was assigned to the 39th district in the city's Huntington Park and Nicetown Tioga sections, which is where she met Randy Davis, who was her supervisor at the time. In the year 1990, Professor Davis graduated from Philadelphia Police Academy and progressed through increasing levels of responsibility, including 10 years as a police sergeant. Professor Davis was responsible for supervising multiple squads and various assignments of 30-plus police officers. He also served over 24 years in the Philadelphia Police Department, including 3 years of tactical administrative supervisor while leading many task forces that include plain clothing for cases that focus on homicides, burglaries, and robberies, and collaborative effort with the FBI. In the year 2004, Sergeant Randy Davis became Elisa Diaz's supervisor. Officer Diaz didn't like that Sergeant Davis would make sexual advances towards her. He would continuously ask her out on a date. He would make surprise visits at her home with the excuse of, as I quote, "I was in the neighborhood." According to the court and police documents, Sergeant Davis would ask if she would consider modeling because he would like to send the photos to Playboy. Officer Diaz became even more uncomfortable when he would make her take ride-alongs that lasted 5 hours. On one occasion, she handed over her logbook for his signature. As I quote, Davis grabbed her hands and began kissing her on the neck. Officer Diaz immediately pushed him away and jumped into her patrol car. When Officer Diaz returned to work, Sergeant Davis accused Officer Diaz of associating with known drug dealers, so he assigned her to a different patrol car by herself and instructed other officers to refrain from backing her up on radio calls. Officer Diaz decided to tell her mother what was going on. Her mother suggested that Elisa should talk to Carl Holmes. All Elisa needed was advice. When she arrived at Carl's office, she explained to Holmes how Sergeant Davis was making her miserable, and she was ready to file an equal employment opportunity complaint. Carl announced that he had known Sergeant Davis for years, and that it might be better for Carl, an internal affairs inspector, to try to talk some sense into Davis. He even spoke against filing the complaint, but told Alyssa to write a memo based on the problem she was having with Davis. He also told her to prepare herself for a fight. Officer Diaz stood up to hand Holmes her account. Holmes moved towards her, sandwiching her between two desks. She says that Carl grabbed her with both hands, lifted her onto a desk, and sexually assaulted her. Officer Diaz then pushed her foot off the desk, knocking something over, which distracted Carl Holmes. Officer Diaz immediately ran from his office. Officer Diaz immediately called her mother and told her mother what had happened. She told her mother that Carl Holmes had molested her. Officer Diaz's mother felt the guilt because it was her idea for her daughter to go see Carl Holmes. Officer Diaz knew that she had to go forward with her complaint, but was worried that no one would believe that two of her supervisors had sexually assaulted her, so she decided to only mention Davis in her 7-page complaint. An officer in the police EEO unit began investigating Officer Diaz's complaint. A few weeks later, Internal Affairs received an anonymous letter that said that Officer Diaz had been hanging out with drug dealers. Later, drugs were found inside of Officer Diaz's trash can outside her home. Internal Affairs cops confiscated her gun and took her off of the streets. Later, she was transferred to the 35th District, where the captain stuck her with guarding sick or injured prisoners. The captain even told Alyssa that he didn't trust her, nor wanted her around. The police department found no evidence that Officer Diaz associated with drug dealers. The EEO officer wrote in his report that Davis did sexually harass Alyssa Diaz. Davis was demoted, transferred, and suspended for 10 days. He filed a grievance through the FOP. Later, he returned back to the 39th District with full back pay. He's now a criminal justice professor at Valley Forge Military Academy and College. Davis says that he never harassed Officer Diaz. In the year 2005, Inspector Carl Holmes transferred to the 25th District. In the year 2006, a woman by the name Krista Hayburn began working as a patrol cop. She was recruited by Inspector Holmes to join a special task force. She'd been on the force for 5 years. To join a force of plainclothing, officers are assigned to high crime areas. Krista looked up to Holmes. He became her mentor. 3 days after Officer Hayburn began the new assignment, the team attended a farewell party for Carl Holmes, who was leaving for a 3-month FBI training program. That night, after Officer Hayburn arrived at a Philly Empire Lounge after mingling with other cops, Krista needed to make a phone call, so she decided to step outside without her coat. Officer Hayburn says while she was outside, Inspector Carl Holmes arrived at her side and led her across the street. She says he pulled her in for a kiss, put his arm around her, and told her how he thought that there was a mutual attraction between the two. Krista told Carl that she was cold. She had convinced him that they needed to go back inside the lounge. Once they were inside, Krista darted into the bathroom. She made a phone call to her friend, Officer Rolly Ramos. She asked him if there was a way for her to leave the club without Carl Holmes seeing her. While Krista was on the phone, Carl opened the bathroom door and told Krista, as I quote, "Don't forget to tell me when you're leaving for the night." A few minutes later, Krista rushed out of the bathroom, grabbed her jacket and her keys, and hurried to her car. But unfortunately, Krista heard Carl calling her name. He then pulled her out of her car and led her into his white city-issue Dodge Durango. Officer Krista Hayburn says Inspector Carl Holmes began kissing her aggressively. He touched her breasts and rubbed between her thighs. Officer Hayburn told Inspector Holmes that it wasn't right and she had to go because her husband was waiting for her. Officer Hayburn says Inspector Holmes shoved his right hand down the back of her pants and forced his finger into her vagina. According to court documents, Officer Elisa Diaz also said that Inspector Holmes forced his tongue into her mouth, groped her breast, and forced his finger into her vagina. He placed her hand onto his penis. She pleaded with him to let her go. She even reminded him that he was her boss and what he was doing was wrong. Officer Hayburn says that Inspector Holmes tried to push her face towards his penis. Officer Hayburn says Inspector Holmes told her to just finish him off because he was leaving and wouldn't be back for 3 months. He even said it will only take a few minutes. Krista told him no. Holmes ejaculated during their encounter. Officer Krista Hayburn fled to her car. Later, she told her friend, Officer Ramos, and her husband about the assault. Her husband asked her if she wanted to go to the hospital or file a complaint. Officer Hayburn said she was too scared to report it. For the next 2 years, Holmes cast a shadow over Hayburn's life. February 2008, Officer Hayburn marched into Internal Affairs headquarters and handed in a complaint form that detailed the assault that took place during Holmes' farewell party. The forensic team found semen stains in Holmes' vehicle. Chief Inspector Holmes claims that he did have intercourse with a woman, but the woman was not Officer Krista Hayburn. Krista says that the department and the city did not take her report seriously or measures to ensure that the perpetrator could not sexually assault others. After filing her report, Krista faced retaliation from the city. They expressed doubt about Krista's medical reports regarding the injury that prevented her from continuing to serve on the police force. In the year 2004, when Michelle Vandergrift was only 22 years old, she joined the police academy. She comes from a family of Philadelphia cops. She was introduced to a man who her father spoke highly of. She says the man thought the world of her father, and her father thought the world of the man. That man was Carl Holmes. After she graduated, she was assigned to the 24th District and East Division, where Holmes was the inspector. In the year 2006, the same year, Holmes promoted Krista Hayburn. Michelle noticed that Carl was paying close attention to her around the office. At first, it seemed harmless until he began calling Michelle and telling her all about how he fantasized about her. In the year 2007, while Michelle was working an overnight shift, she was summoned to Holmes' office. Holmes was at his desk wearing an Eagles jersey and smoking a cigarette. He made sexual comments on her thighs. He walked towards her. Allegedly, he stuck his hands down her pants and penetrated her. Afterwards, he put his fingers in his mouth and said, as I quote, "You taste so good." Michelle stumbled out of his office. Just like Krista Hayburn and Elisa Diaz, Michelle didn't know what to do. She tried to bury the trauma of the assault, only to find out that it became too overwhelming. What's been brushed under the rug? In the year 1990, when Holmes was a new recruit with 19 days on the force, he was at a bar at 1:30 a.m. He got into a fight with a man. The man says that Holmes grabbed him by the throat and slammed his head into a car. The man was taken to the hospital. He had a small abrasion on the back of his head and on his neck. The complaint was not taken seriously by investigators because the two men had been drinking. In the year 1992, Holmes brutally beat a man for urinating in a North Philly alley. What Holmes didn't know was that the man was a kidney recipient. When the man's friends tried to explain to Holmes about their friend's kidney condition, Holmes demanded for the men to shut up. Later, Holmes denied what had happened. Commissioner Neal suspended Holmes for 20 days, but Holmes appealed and got the punishment reduced to 5 days. Elisa Diaz became a shell of her former self. In the aftermath of her assault, she developed post-traumatic stress disorder. major depressive disorder, severe anxiety, and insomnia. She saw a psychiatrist who prescribed medications. Diaz stayed on the police force but suffered a knee injury that required surgery. She was later fired. She had lost everything. She had no job, nowhere to live. She even chopped off her long brown hair. Eventually, she moved in with her parents. Weeks after Carl Holmes was interviewed about Krista Hayburn, Internal Affairs investigators was approached by a woman who had her own disturbing story. She claims that one night in the year 2006, she was drinking at a bar on Germantown Avenue when she was approached by a tall black man with a mustache. He was wearing wire-rimmed glasses. She claims that she left her drink unattended while she used the restroom. Later, she felt sick and had to use the restroom again, but this time leaving her keys behind. When she returned, her keys were missing. The man sitting next to her offered her a ride, but she declined. Plus, she only lived a block and a half away, so she decided to walk home. Within moments later, she noticed that she was being slowly followed by a large white SUV. The man rolled down the window and insisted that she get in. Once she realized it was the same man from the bar, she immediately rushed home and told her husband what was going on. Her husband looked outside and the SUV was gone. The couple never reported what happened. In the year 2012, a woman named Keisha Johnson accused one of the top commanders in Internal Affairs. She says that Staff Inspector Gerald Bates tried to force her into a sexual relationship in order to keep her job. Inspector Anthony Washington had been accused of sexually harassing 4 female police officers and a Temple University student who once tried to interview him for a school project. In the year 2019, Chief Inspector Carl Holmes was arrested and charged with sexually assaulting 3 female officers. Philadelphia's police commissioner, Richard Ross, decided to resign after it came out that he had ignored women's complaints of being physically and verbally harassed by their supervisors and colleagues. Ross had been with the department since the year 1989. Between the years 2007 and 2019, the city of Philadelphia settled at least 36 federal lawsuits with female police officers over claims of sexual misconduct or racial or gender discrimination. The city paid out more than $2.3 million in settlements.
I am a statistic. I am a victim of rape. Raped by a colleague, a mentor, my boss, a City of Philadelphia police inspector. January 2006, I was asked by the inspector to join his elite task force. I accepted the opportunity with the belief that I had been chosen because I was a good cop. Unfortunately, that was not the case. 3 days after I began the East Task Force on January 6th, 2006, my new unit was hosting a going-away party at a local bar for my inspector's upcoming departure to the FBI Academy. The night started off like any other. We danced, we drank,